Alright, greetings of peace be upon you. And let us begin in the name of God, the most gracious and most merciful. Peace and blessings upon all the prophets, from Prophet Adam to right up to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his family and his companions. Welcome to the 4th edition of Exchange Verses. So if you have been following the editions, the last time we had was also at the same venue with Habib, Kadzim, but we had Dr. Sirin Kate instead, and he couldn't make it today, and he has sent his best representation, which is Dr. Anthony Loke. So he came all the way from Seremban just to be with us. So as per our usual format, we will have each speaker speak for 45 minutes each, and then we will have Q&A, okay, straightforward. So now it's already 8:07. We hope to finish by 10 sharp, because that's how long we have actually rented this place. Okay. Okay. Before we begin, let me introduce our honored speakers. Our first guest speaker for today is Habib Kadzim Assagaf. He is born in Tahrir, Hadramaut, as you may know, in 1960, and has direct lineage to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A highly respected scholar, Habib Kadzim is considered an expert in many areas of Islamic sacred sciences, including jurisprudence, but the prophetic biography, theology, principles of jurisprudence, and in particular, hadith and its related sciences. He is no longer a stranger to Malaysia. He comes here annually for this last few years, and we welcome him with open arms. Our next special guest speaker for today is Dr. Anthony Loke. He was ordained a Methodist pastor for 32 years, and during that time he lectured for 19 years in the area of the Old Testament in the Seminary Theology Malaysia, based in Negeri Sembilan, Seremban. He holds a PhD in the Old Testament from the University of Wales, United Kingdom, and he has authored around 9 books and numerous articles in publication. Alright, so we have two learned scholars. We pray and hope that we will benefit somehow from both of these presentations. Yeah? So without further ado, let me call upon the first speaker, Dr. Anthony Loke, to present his. Welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you, friends. This is my first time sharing in a seminar like this. I must thank my friend Sirin for giving me the opportunity, and of course for Justin for inviting me to come. I must say this will be a good learning experience for me as well. We are supposed to talk on this topic, Moses and the Divided Sea, and Justin has given us a bit of privilege to talk about the significance, which I will talk more about it today. We Christians and Jewish people call this whole story the Exodus. So where does the Exodus word come from? If you actually look at the word, it's not an English word. Okay? It is actually a word which comes from the Greek. So it's actually the name of the second book of Moses, Exodus. And the Hebrew name for the book actually is a different name, Semut. People always say it sounds like Semut. Semut means the names of, because that's the word that begins the book. So where does this word Exodus come from? It comes from 2 Greek words, ex and hodos. How did we get this Greek translation? It's actually very interesting. The Jewish people had scriptures, and it was written in Hebrew. But after a long time, the Jewish people no longer speak Hebrew, and they were living in the Greek Empire, and they spoke more of Greek language. And so they asked for the Old Testament to be translated into Greek, and that's where they came up with this word, ex and hodos. Ex is a preposition which means out of. Hodos is a word which means the way or the path of the road. Combine these 2 words together, exodos, that's where you get this word. And so today it is now an English word. And exodus is a word which means exit or departure, or a procession, or sometimes even a word for military expedition. And once was used by Jesus, Isa Amase, as a word to refer to his own death, Exodus. So that's why we had the Greek word Exodus. When the Bible was translated to Latin, it became Exodus with a U, and that's how it came into Shakespearean English, Exodus. So today, when you look at the dictionary, you find this is an English word, but if you look at it, actually it's not an English word, it comes from the Greek. Now, the name itself, they say, sums up the whole story of Exodus. This is the way out of Egypt. This whole book of Exodus, the second book of Musa, is the whole story of the Exodus event. I think all of us know this story by heart. It talks about deliverance of the people of God from Egypt. And the whole story starts with the people suffering in Egypt for about 400 years. A new Pharaoh arose and he didn't remember all the good things the people did, and then began to oppress the people. And the people began to call out to God and ask God for help. And that's when God sent a deliverer, Musa. And here we see the contest between God and Moses one side, Pharaoh and Pharaoh and all his gods on the other side. And here we have the story of the 10 plagues, how Moses changed the water, remember water changed to blood, and then from the blood came out the frogs, and then the frogs came out the lice. So all these 10 plagues to challenge the gods of Egypt. And of course the story continued on how they crossed the Red Sea, how they journeyed to this mountain called Mount Sinai. And then that's where Moses goes up the mountain to receive the law, the Torah. And then later the people journey in the wilderness for the next 40 years. So the story actually of Exodus is not just the middle one about the contest between the two, but the whole story from suffering all the way to deliverance. And the story will end with people crossing the river Jordan and enter into what we call the Promised Land. So if you look at the story of Exodus, it's actually a very long story. If you ask a lot of Western people today, what is the most important event in history? A lot of them will actually say something like the French Revolution is the most important event. Because in the French Revolution, remember, it was basically a call for justice, for liberty, for freedom. But if you ask the people of the Abrahamic faith, for us Christians, for us the most important event is the life and the death of Jesus, Isa al-Masih. For Muslims, it will probably be, if I'm correct, the prophet's revelation from Angel Gabriel, and then the Hijrah from the exile in 622. Perhaps that will be your center of the importance. But if you ask the Jewish people, they will say, yes, the Exodus is the most important event, because from this one event, it will affect many other stories down the road. In fact, today you can find it, they call it, this is the event of human history. Every time when we see people oppressed, people struggling against oppression, the theme of Exodus is always there. Today, as you read the newspapers, you remember the people in Myanmar, the Rohingyas. It's like oppression, and then you need people to liberate and deliver them. Or let's look to Kelantan at the Orang Asam, the Tamias, and then they're being oppressed by the government authorities. So in every instance, this is an event which has generated other events in history. So let me begin a little bit from the Jewish perspective, because the story of Exodus comes from their scriptures. Actually not from the Christians. The Christians adopted the Old Testament as part of our Al-Kitab. So this part actually belongs to the Jews, okay, this story. So let me share 5 things how the Jews look at the story of Exodus. First, they will say this story is something which happened historically. Now today you find there are a lot of critics. They will say, no, there's no such story as Exodus. Because first of all, we have no evidence. If you go and search all the so-called pyramids in Egypt and you look at all the inscriptions, we don't find a single mention of an event called the Exodus. We don't find of any pharaoh who was defeated by a bunch of slaves. Okay. So a lot of people question whether it is historical. But the Jews said, no, this is a historical event. And there are basically 2 dates we can actually put. So in my class, I teach my students, I think my students will remember, there is an old date called 1450 BC. That means about 3,450 years ago. People believe that the Exodus happened at that time and under the pharaoh called Moses III. That will be the picture. This picture is from British Museum. Okay. But for some Christians, we think that no, it's a bit too early. The date of Exodus probably is about 1250 BC. And the pharaoh at that time who was the oppressor is that very famous pharaoh, Ramesses II, and that is his picture. The Jews have a a different view. They say it's actually about 1350, and that will be a different pharaoh. Okay? So we're not going to debate this. This is either one of these three were the pharaoh that Moses had to challenge and to free his people. So first of all, they look at it as a historical event, something that happened in their history. Secondly, this is also what we call spiritual, because it's very strange when you look at the history of a people. The secular history of the people are also part of their religious history. For example, what happened in the time of Exodus, about 3,000 years ago, is now found in the Alkitab, the Bible. Now look at Malaysia today. If you look at let's say the story of the Malacca Sultanate, Sultan Mansur Shah and all these people, their history is not religious history. Their history is only secular history. Their history is not part of our Bible, part of our scriptures. For Christians, we have the story of, for example, the early church. The church we started after the time of Jesus, and this story is found in the book of Acts, and is found now in our Bible. And for the Muslims, you have the story of the Prophet, and you have all the story, that account are all found. So, in a sense, therefore, secular history is also now part of spiritual history. Now here we do have a bit of problem, because first of all, I'm a Christian and I'm Chinese. Jewish history is not my history. Okay, bukan sejarah forefather. So we have to accept it in a different way. Okay. Third, I think this is the most famous. They look at this story as a paradigm. Paradigm means a model that can be applied not just one time but many different times. And it's a model of deliverance from oppression, from bondage to slavery. And so some people say this is a dialectic of slavery and liberation, which is true. As I said, you look at it, you have on one side the oppressor, the Egyptians. On the other side, the victims, the oppressed, the Israelites. And in every event that we find now in human history, there's always one side the oppressor, there's always one side the oppressed. One side the tyrant, and one side the victims. So today we can still speak of the pharaohs of today. Okay? People who behave and act just like Pharaoh. And there are also people just like Israelites who suffer in human history. So this paradigm has come down to us. And it's an important paradigm because we find a few things. First, God hears the people, and then God sends Moses as a deliverer. And God promised he will do 4 things. Now these 4 things are recorded in the book of Exodus, chapter 6, verse 6 to 7. God promised to do 4 things, 4 I will. First is, God says, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Secondly, I will deliver you from slavery. Third, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. God will fight on their behalf. And then God says, I will take you to be my people. God will become their God, and the people will become God's people. And this 4 I will is today still remembered. Every year when a Jew remembers this story, at the Passover meal, I will explain a little bit more later, they will drink 4 cups of wine. Each cup represents one of the I will. So it's something that is important to remember. God promised deliverance, and the Jews act it out year after year as they celebrate. So this paradigm of deliverance is so important that it's actually not just once. The Old Testament, the Kadzim language, speaks of it 2 times. The first time we find it happening here, from Egypt. They travel all the way out and went to the land of Canaan. And we call this the first Exodus. About 700 years later, the people sinned against God, and they were exiled to Babylon. We call this period the Pembuangan. And in exile, they will suffer for 50 years. Then God will hear the cry, God will liberate them, and from Babylon, they will travel all the way back to the land of Canaan. A reverse Exodus. And the Bible actually says this is like a second Exodus. So the Exodus event is commemorated not just once, but twice. For us Christians, we'll see one more time. The Exodus event also can be symbolized in the way we become a Christian. Once I was in the kingdom of darkness under Satan, and then God delivered me through Jesus is our Masih, and then now I'm on my way to heaven through the promised land. So we see one more time as Christians. So the model is a very powerful model. It's something which we can use even today in different situations. Okay. The 4th perspective is the Jews remember this story every year. Now imagine, if this story is about 3,450 years old, the Exodus event happened 3,400 years ago. And every year they remember this story by having a meal. And in this meal they have three symbolic things. First, the roast lamb, the unleavened bread, bread without yeast, tanpa ragi. And then you have bitter herbs, which you eat. Three main things on the dish. The lamb represents that lamb that was slain. The people took the blood and smeared on the doorpost of the house. So that when the angel of death passed over, and the angel sees the blood on the doorpost, the angel will pass over this house. But when you come to the house of the Egyptians and they don't have the blood smeared on the doorpost, the angel of death will then kill the firstborn. So they eat that roast lamb to remember the blood of the lamb. Then they eat the bread without yeast. Why bread without yeast? Because no time to make bread and let the yeast ferment the dough. So they eat bread, and the bread is very thin and crispy like cream cracker. You can actually break it, not like a roti canai, it's very soft. Okay, it's like cream cracker you can break. Then they have the bitter herbs to remember their bitter suffering. Now each year, even till today, every year the Jews celebrate the Passover. This is how they do it today in a modern Jewish home. They will have unleavened bread to remember their leaving Egypt in haste. They will have a bowl of the lamb to remember the blood that was shed. They will have the bitter herbs to remember the bitter suffering. Today they have a bowl of salt water to remember the tears they cried in Egypt. A very symbolic, powerful reminder. And they're drinking 4 cups of wine to represent 4 I wills that God promised to do for them. So each year when they celebrate the Passover, they actually relive, they actually go through the whole experience. It will start at 6 p.m. at night, and the whole service order will go right down to maybe 12 midnight, 2 a.m. They will just sing, tell stories. The children will ask their papa, what's the significance of this, what's the significance of this, and they just live it out. Every year they live out the story of the Exodus. And imagine if you do that for 3,400 years, this story is built into you, and you remember this story. Remember what is this paradigm? Deliverance from slavery, from oppression. And that's why it is built into the Jewish psyche. They always remember justice, liberation, freedom. So the fifth area, the final area, this story somehow has transformed the Jewish thinking and mind, and therefore in a way also transformed our thinking as Christians. For example, the Exodus event, against many gods in Egypt, God told them, I am the Lord your God, who took you out from the land of Egypt. And so therefore, absolute loyalty to this one God. And then, remember the redemption principle, the lamb died, so that the blood can be used to smear the doorpost, so that the angel will pass over their house and spare. So imagine, it's a very selective killing. In every home, every firstborn not just of children, but firstborn even of animals, the firstborn cat, the firstborn dog, the firstborn cow, the firstborn son died. Okay. And so here, to remember how God saved them, the lamb died, saved the whole Jewish family. Then the principle of thanksgiving, right now the people remember this act. They really thank God. Remember, these people were a bunch of slaves in Egypt. They were nobody. They had no power, no strength to fight. And yet God heard their prayer, sent a deliverer called Moses and his brother Harun, and then together they will lead the people free. And then coming out of Egypt is for a purpose. They have to stop along the way to a place called Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is in Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula. If you go back a bit, you can see this picture. Mount Sinai is somewhere here. I've been here once in 1999, and I climbed up this mountain. This is a place where Jewish and Christian tradition, and even Islamic tradition, says that Moses met God, and God gave to Moses the law, the 10 commandments. So here, they go up to this mountain, and then God gave them the law. Why give them the law? Remember, they were all just slaves. Slaves with no rules and regulations. But by giving them the law, the Torah, it gives them some sense of identity. It gives them some sense of belonging. And now people know that these people are very unique. In fact, when you look at Jewish law, they're very unique. You work 6 days, you rest 7 days. Okay? And then they also sunnah, circumcise the children. Then they also work 6 years on the field, the farm. On the 7th year, they will stop farming, and then they will rest 7th year. So these are very peculiar laws, peculiar to the people. Then for the Exodus story, we have now morality. And this is something which today we see. Why is it that today we have this whole idea of justice, especially for the weak, for the marginalized, for the defenseless, for the poor? It's now built into their laws because the story reminds the people, once you were slaves, once you were humble, and now you have been set free. Therefore now you cannot do this to others. You must defend those who are weak, those who are marginalized, those who have no voice, and those who are defenseless. And that's why you have all these laws that are found in the Old Testament, very unique laws. Christianity and Islam shares a lot of these same laws like the Jews. For example, we do not oppress our widows, nor the orphans, or the poor. We don't cheat them. We do not charge high interest usury. Even when we manure our fields, we must leave some of the corners there with some of the wheat, so that the poor people can come to the corners and cut the wheat. These are very good laws. And sometimes I think we should think about laws like this. Today when we harvest something, we potak everything, we leave nothing behind. They're supposed to leave all the corners of the field for the poor people to eat. And then people who are strangers in the land, people who are outsiders, foreigners, they have no rights of justice. And the Jews say you must treat them like your own. Now, do they think about our foreign mates who come to work with us? Sometimes the way we treat them, we don't even treat them like human beings. We abuse them. Okay? The laws here are very strong. And then make sure you do not overwork the land. 6 years you work, 7 years you must rest. Allow the land to recover back its strength. But today, look at the way we farm our land, we oppress our land, we exploit our land. Then, not just 7 years, but at the 50th year called the Jubilee year. 7 times 7, 49 years. 49 years of working on the land, at the 50th year, you must proclaim a year of Jubilee, freedom. Land that has been sold, that originally belonged to the people, the owners, must be given back to them. If you were a slave, you must be set free, all sorts of things. Now, all these laws came out because once they were slaves. See, the Exodus paradigm infiltrates into all this whole system of laws, principles. So, in a way, when we look from the Christian perspective, we have inherited a lot of these things from the Jewish side. So for us, we also say, yes, we look at the story of Exodus as something that's historical. Okay? And most of the Christian scholars would say it's something that happened about 3,450 years ago. Although we do not have concrete proof, you can go to Egypt and you can look at all the archaeological data. We do not have anything that says this is the date of the Exodus. We have nothing from the time of Moses. We don't have Moses wrought his tongkat. How we wish have his tongkat. It's a very powerful tongkat. Remember, you can change it to a snake, and the snake can eat up all the other tongkat of the Pharaoh. We don't have all these things. We don't have the ark. We don't have anything left behind. And even the details of how they came out of Egypt, did they cross through the Red Sea or did they cross through a smaller sea? We don't have any details. But this event is so important. One Christian scholar by the name of Mackenzie says, if Moses did not exist, we should have to invent him. That means he's saying, this story is so powerful, it changed the whole structure of worship and life and faith of the Jewish people. If Moses never exists, somehow these things cannot happen. That means there must have been something like this that happened which affected. And I think, and we Christians also believe that, yes, this is something which is real and it happened in history. Although we cannot prove exactly when was the Exodus, but we know it happened. For us Christians, we also treat it as part of our spiritual history. As I say, I'm a Chinese, I'm a Christian. The Jewish history is not my history, okay? But we treat it as a spiritual history. So Abraham becomes our spiritual forefather. Musa becomes our spiritual lawgiver. And in fact, when we look at the Exodus event, it's like a symbol of our own Christian life. Let me show you how. This is what happened in the story of the Exodus. The people were suffering in Egypt under this Pharaoh. God sent Moses to come. Moses fought with the Pharaoh, and then they brought the people to the Red Sea. They crossed the Red Sea, came to Mount Sinai, they received the law, and then they went out for 40 years wandering in the wilderness. But the people, unfortunately, did not trust God. It took 40 years to wander. Finally, they came to the river Jordan, they crossed the river, and they landed on the other side of the promised land. Look at it, it's like a symbol of our own Christian life. I am a first generation Christian. That means my parents were not Christians. So in a sense, I was once in the kingdom of darkness. Pharaoh was Satan. I was under his rule and his bondage. Then one day I believe in Jesus. He's an Amase. He's like the second Moses. He delivered me. And when the people cross the Red Sea, this is like what I go through, water baptism. We have this ritual of water baptism. And then when people go to Mount Sinai, I too have experiences where I become very close to God. We call this mountaintop experience. And then my life on earth now, I'm now 58 years old, that's my journey on earth. One day when I die, I will cross the river Jordan. The river Jordan is like the river of death. I cross over and I'll land on the promised land, which is now Shurga, heaven. So you see, our own experience as Christian is something like the spiritual experience of the Jews from Egypt all the way to the promised land. That's why this paradigm is so important. It figures now in the way we now experience our own Christian life. So for us Christians, we can see the Exodus experience is something very powerful. Christians also look at the Exodus from another form of interpretation called allegory. It was very popular many centuries ago, but today we don't use it. Sometimes we do hear of preachers from Pupa using the allegory. Allegory is a way of interpretation which sees a lot of hidden meaning. So that means you have a story, the story is just on the surface, but allegory will say there's something deeper beyond, beneath. Okay. Before I explain this, let me give you a very simple example of an allegory. In one of the stories that Jesus told, the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think a lot of people know this story. There was a man who was walking down, and one day he got robbed by the robbers, and then the robbers left him half dead. Then along the way, a Jewish priest walked past, and then he didn't save this person. And then there was a Jewish Levite who went past, he also didn't help this person. And finally, a Samaritan, one of the enemies of the Jews. And this man stopped and helped this Jewish man. And then that shows us how we ought to be neighbor. Now this is one story at one level. Allegory will say every part of the story has a deeper meaning. Okay? So some people will argue the man who went walking down from Jerusalem to Jericho represents Adam. Adam left heaven, he started walking on earth, and then that's where he got beaten up by the robbers. Who are the robbers? Satan and all his evil spirits. Then who is the priest and Levite? All those church leaders who needed help. And who is the Samaritan? Jesus. So allegory will see a deeper meaning behind a story. Now in the actual story, the Jews and the Christians also look at it and see deeper stories behind. For example, in the Exodus story, you find that 3 times the people asked Moses, we have no water to drink. And then Moses took out his stick and remember, hit the rock, and then the rock split and water came out. Okay? And the Jews then say, how come this rock keep on giving water? And so the Jews say, this rock actually keep rolling and following the people in the desert. So wherever the people stop, the rock will roll there, and then Moses will hit the rock and the water will come out again. Christians also pick up this story, and in 1 Corinthians 10, which is in the New Testament, you have Paul the Apostle talking about this allegory. Notice this. It says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers, the Jewish people, who were all under the cloud. They all passed through the Red Sea, and all were baptized into Moses, into the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, but they all drank from the spiritual rock. Because the rock which the Jewish people say follow the people as they travel. But then Paul allegorises one more step and says this rock is now Jesus. So this is one way of reading a story of the Exodus. Look for deeper meaning. So the rock which gave them water, there was Jesus. Another way of looking at allegory is, some people say when Moses parted the Red Sea and the water split in two, they say, when Jesus died on the cross, it's mentioned at the 6th hour, that means 3 p.m. At 3 p.m. there was darkness in the land. And then at the 9th hour, 6 hours at 12 noon, and then at 3 p.m. the sun fell, and then the curtain that separated the temple day torn, just like the Red Sea opened up, and then people standing here to see what was inside. So people argue, see the story of the Exodus is like an allegory of Jesus' death. When Moses opened the sea and the people walked through, today now we have access to God because the temple curtain has been split into two. So you also find people interpreting the story of Exodus this way. But for me, the most important interpretation is the same, a paradigm of deliverance. Let me explain how it comes up into all these stories. In the 18th century, 19th century in America, remember there was these Negro slaves captured from Africa by the Americans, the white Americans, captured and brought all the way to work in the cotton fields. And there, the Negroes were given the Bible and they became Christians. And they used to sing these songs. These Negro spirituals are songs which they sing in the cotton field. And they were slaves. But they sang a beautiful song, and these songs were all framed by the story of the Exodus. Songs like, "Oh Freedom, oh Freedom, oh Freedom, oh Freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." See, the story of the Exodus is found even in the song they sing, okay, the Negro spirituals. And then in the 1960s in America, there is this black theology, people like James Cone. And again, they use the Exodus as a paradigm, liberation from bondage, from freedom, from oppression, from the white. Then in the liberation theology, they came from South America. And again, you will find liberation theology. These are movements which, again, struggle against economic, spiritual, political, social bondage, oppression, all forms. And they are basically grassroots movements oppressing against oppressors. And Minjung theology comes from Korea, and again, this is a grassroots theology informed by the Exodus paradigm, liberation from slavery, from bondage, from oppression. So in a way, the Exodus event continues to speak to us in the sense of a moral sense. How do we today live it out? It's not something that happened just in the past 3,000, 400 years ago, but how does it affect us today? Today, when I see, for example, the Orang Asal of Batam having their lands invaded by the logging companies, okay, do we not speak out? Or do we see the Rohingyas, refugees come? And remember Malaysia 2 years ago, we pushed them back into the sea. Again, the Exodus experience will speak to us, how do we then speak out against such injustice? And so Christians, therefore, in a sense, are also informed by the story of the Exodus. That's why today, when you look at a lot of these Western laws, the Western laws has a lot of basis on the Jewish and Christian idea. Why give justice to the weak and the poor? This is our foundation for social justice. So as Christians, and perhaps even I think all the three Abrahamic religions, this is our foundation for social justice. The Exodus reminds us, once we were slaves, we were nobody, but God delivered us. So how can we today now close our ears to the poor? Because the Bible says God will always hear the cries of the poor. And so these principles of living, again today we do this. So for example, let me show you in Acts chapter 2, one of the books in the New Testament. This is like a picture of the early church. In those days, there was no camera, so they have to describe what the early church was like. This is only about just 1 or 2 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. They, that means the Christians, devoted themselves to the apostles. There were 12 of these grassroots apostles, teaching in the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, the communion and prayers. And then notice, people looked at this group of people and they all became afraid. All came upon every soul, because these people could do signs and wonders. And not only that, it says, as they were together, they shared things in common. Notice, there were no poor. Everybody shared. If I had more, they would actually give away. So in the story later down in chapter 6, people who have extra pieces of land, sold them, use the money, and then distribute the money to the poor people. And they were selling their possessions and belongings. That means you have an extra piece of land you don't need, sell it, share it with all. And day by day, they went together to worship God. They broke bread in their homes, they received food with thanksgiving in their hearts, and they praised God. And notice, it was a very powerful thing. People were being drawn to the church, and the church grew. 5,000 people were added in a single day. So this is a picture of a church, of the early church. Again, notice social justice, taking care of the poor, the orphans, the widows, and all this is because informed by the Exodus paradigm. So the Exodus paradigm is something very powerful. Okay? So let me just end by saying this. Today we find that a lot of people who are oppressed on the margin, the victimized, they are attracted to this Exodus paradigm. Because the Exodus paradigm tells us God still hears the cries of the people. Sometimes I think in Malaysia, we wonder, people seem to get away, MACC, do cancel people, but for them become released. Where are all the big fish? Sometimes you wonder, does God hear and then does God act? I still believe yes, God will. Even if not in this life, in the next life. Okay. So here, those who find that they are the downtrodden, oppressed, those who have no voice and all this, they are attracted by this paradigm, because this paradigm tells us there's a God who cares. God is on the side of the poor, weak, and defenseless. And this Exodus is what we call an everlasting paradigm. It still works. 3,000 years later, we find the Exodus still works today. We still find it happening. God works and deals with people. And today we read and reread and reread this same story. In fact, you look at the Jewish story, it has occurred many times. First time in Egypt, second time in Babylon, and later when the Romans conquered the Jewish people and then bombed them out of the country, again you find the same Exodus event happening. And then 1944-45, the Holocaust event, the Jews suffer again under the Nazis. Again, this story repeats itself. And the story repeats itself again and again and again in Jewish, Christian, and as well, I think, in Slavic history. So as one Old Testament scholar by the name of Terence Graham says, God is the champion of the poor. God is one who liberates from the pharaohs of the world. So today we need to find who are the pharaohs of this world. And God will be against them, because God is always on the side of those who are poor. So the Exodus story is a very powerful story. We still hear it today, we still read it today, but we must also learn to act it out today in our lives. Not just treating it as something that happened 3,000 years ago, but it is still something that happens today. God still hears the cries of the poor, God still acts, and God still brings people out of slavery, whether in the historical sense, the spiritual sense, or even in a moral sense. So for us Christians, we share a very rich heritage. And I think when we look at it, as I say, this Exodus experience is very intrinsic part of our Christian faith. So I'm waiting to hear what Habib Kadzim has to share from the Islamic side, because that will add one more dimension from the third Abrahamic religion on this whole area of the Exodus. So thank you.